Hey everyone, I'm Toni Land, and welcome back to Unlocking Knowledge, where we are currently reading The Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise, Project 2025. Now, this was written in 2023 by the Heritage Foundation. Now, people often ask, why are we embarking on this unlocking knowledge journey? And I will tell you, it goes back to my people being destroyed because of a lack of knowledge. And so we're being intentional and we're stepping back from being spoon-fed information and truly leaning in and reading and getting information for ourselves, so that then we can step away and prayerfully see God inform our own thoughts and our own opinions. So with that being said, I will not be sharing my thoughts or opinions either, as I don't want to be an influence on you. So let's get started in today's reading. Now, last session, we finished up chapter 3, which closed out section 1 for us. In section 1, which was entitled Taking the Reins of Government, we completed 3 chapters. Chapter 1, White House Office. Chapter 2, Executive Office of the President of the United States. And Chapter 3, Central Personnel Agencies Managing the Bureaucracy. So now we are going to dig into section 2. Section 2, entitled The Common Defense. And we're going to read the intro, and then that'll lead us into chapter 4. While the lives of Americans are affected in noteworthy ways, for better or worse, by each part of the executive branch, the inherent importance of national defense and foreign affairs makes the Department of Defense and State first among equals. Originating in the George Washington administration, the War Department, as it was known then, was headed by Henry Knox, America's chief artillery officer in the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, was the first Secretary of State. Despite such long and storied histories, neither department is currently living up to its standards, and the success of the next presidency will be determined in part by whether they can be significantly improved in short order. Ever since our founding, former Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller writes in Chapter 4, Americans have understood that the surest way to avoid war is to be prepared for it in peace. Yet, the Department of Defense is a deeply troubled institution. It has emphasized leftist politics over military readiness. Recruiting was the worst in 2022 that it has been in 2 generations. And the Biden administration's profoundly unserious equity agenda and vaccine mandates have taken a serious toll. Additionally, Miller writes that the atrophy of our defense industrial base, the impact of sequestration, and effective disarmament by many U.S. allies have exacted a high toll on America's military. Moreover, our military has adopted a risk-averse culture. Think of masked soldiers, sailors, and airmen, rather than instilling and rewarding courage in thought and action. The good news is that most enlisted personnel and most officers, especially below the rank of general or admiral, continue to be patriotic defenders of liberty. But this is now Barack Obama's General Officers Corps. That is why Russ Vought argues in Chapter 2 that the National Security Council should rigorously review all general and flag officer promotions to prioritize the core roles and responsibilities of the military over social engineering and non-defense related matters, including climate change, critical race theory, manufactured extremism, and other polarizing policies that weaken our armed forces and discourage our nation's finest men and women from enlisting. Ensuring that many of America's best and brightest continue to choose military service is essential. By far the most significant danger to America from abroad, Miller writes, is China. That communist regime is undertaking a historic military buildup, which could result in nuclear force that matches or exceeds America's own nuclear arsenal. Resisting Chinese expansionist aims requires a denial defense, whereby we make the subordination of Taiwan or other U.S. allies in Asia prohibitively difficult. However, Miller adds that critically, the United States must be able to do this at a level of cost and risk that Americans are willing to bear. The best gauge of such willingness is congressional approval. Accordingly, we must rediscover and adhere to the founders' wise division of war powers, whereby Congress, the most representative and deliberative branch, decides whether to go to war, and the executive, the most energetic and decisive branch, decides how to carry it out once begun. As the past 75 years have repeatedly demonstrated in different ways, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, we depart from our constitutional design at our peril. Miller writes that we must treat missile defense as a top priority, ensure that more of our weapons are made in America, reform the budgeting process, and sustain an efficient and effective counterterrorism enterprise. Across all of our efforts, we must keep in mind that part of peace through strength is knowing when to fight. As George Washington warned nearly 2 centuries ago, we must continue to be on guard against being drawn into conflicts that do not justify great loss of American treasure or significant shedding of American blood. At the same time, we must be prepared to defend our interest and meet challenges where and when they arise. An effective diplomatic corps is central to defending our interest in influencing world events. Whereas most military personnel have had leftist priorities imposed from above, the problem at stake comes largely from within. Former State Department Director of Policy Planning, Kieron Skinner, writes in Chapter 6, large swaths of the State Department's workforce are left-wing and predisposed to disagree with a conservative president's policy agenda and vision. She adds that the department possesses a belief that it is an independent institution that knows what is best for the United States, sets its own foreign policy, and does not need direction from an elected president, a view that does not align with the Constitution. The solution to this problem is strong political leadership. Skinner writes, the next administration must take swift and decisive steps to reforge the department into a lean and functional diplomatic machine that serves the president and thereby the American people. Because the Senate has been extraordinarily lax in fulfilling its constitutional obligation to confirm presidential appointees, she recommends putting appointees into acting roles until such time as the Senate confirms them. Skinner writes that states should also stop skirting the Constitution's treaty-making requirements and stop enforcing agreements as treaties. It should encourage more trade with allies particularly with Great Britain, and less with adversaries. It should implement a sovereign Mexico policy, as our neighbor has functionally lost its sovereignty due to muscular criminal cartels that effectively run the country. In Africa, Skinner writes, the U.S. should focus on core security, economic, and human rights, rather than impose radical abortion and pro-LGBT initiatives. Decisive symbols such as the rainbow flag or the Black Lives Matter flag have no place next to the stars and stripes at our embassies. When it comes to China, Skinner writes that a policy of complete where we must, cooperate where we can, has demonstrably failed. The People's Republic of China, PRC, aggressive behavior, she writes, can only be curbed through external pressure. Efforts to protect or excuse China must stop. She observes many were quick to dismiss even the possibility that COVID escaped from a Chinese research laboratory. Meanwhile, Skinner writes, global leaders, including President Joe Biden, have tried to normalize or even laud Chinese behavior. She adds, in some cases, these voices, like global corporate giants BlackRock and Disney, or the National Basketball Association, NBA, directly benefit from doing business with Beijing. Former Vice President of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Maura Nambar, writes in Chapter 8 that we need to have people working for the USAGM who actually believe in America, rather than allowing the agencies to function as an anti-American, taxpayer-funded entities that parrot our adversaries' propaganda and talking points. Former acting Deputy Director of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, says in Chapter 5 that the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, a creation of the George W. Bush era, should be closed, as it has added needless additional bureaucracy and expense without corresponding benefit. He recommends that it be replaced with a new standalone border and immigration agency at the cabinet level, and that the remaining parts of the DHS be distributed among other departments. Former Chief of Staff for the Director of National Intelligence, Dustin Carmack, writes in Chapter 7 that the U.S. Intelligence Agency is too inclined to look in the rearview mirror, engage in groupthink, and employ an overly cautious approach aimed at personal approval rather than at offering the most accurate, unvarnished intelligence for the benefit of the country. And in Chapter 9, former acting Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Max Primorik, asserts that the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, must be reformed. The Biden administration has deformed the agency by treating it as a global platform to pursue overseas a divisive political and cultural agenda that promotes abortion, climate extremism, gender radicalism, and interventions against perceived systemic racism. If the recommendations in the following chapters are adopted, what Skinner says about the State Department could be true for other parts of the federal government's national security and foreign policy apparatus. The next conservative president has the opportunity to restructure the making and execution of U.S. defense and foreign policy and reset the nation's role in the world. The recommendations outlined in this section provide guidance on how the next president should use the federal government's vast resources to do just that. Chapter 4, Department of Defense by Christopher Miller. The Constitution requires the federal government to provide for the common defense. It assigns to Congress the authority to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy, and specifies that the president is the commander-in-chief of America's armed forces. Ever since our founding, Americans have understood that the surest way to avoid war is to be prepared for it in peace. But when deterrence fails, we must fight and win. The Department of Defense, DoD, is the largest part of the federal government. It has almost 3 million people serving in uniform or a civilian capacity throughout the world and consumes approximately $850 billion annually, more than 50% of our government's discretionary spending. The DoD is also a deeply troubled institution. Historically, the military has been one of America's most trusted institutions, but years of sustained misuse, a two-tiered culture of accountability that shields senior officers and officials while exposing junior officers and soldiers in the field, wasteful spending, wildly shifting security policies, exceedingly poor discipline in program execution, and most recently, the Biden administration's profoundly unserious equity agenda and vaccine mandates have taken a serious toll. Our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, our impossibly muddled China strategy, the growing involvement of senior military officers in the political arena, and deep confusion about the purpose of our military are clear signals of a disturbing decay and markers of a dangerous decline in our nation's capabilities and will. Additionally, more than 100,000 Americans die annually in large measure because of illicit narcotic flows, more than 4 times as many people in 1 year as we lost in our 20-year war against Al-Qaeda. We are also witnessing a transformation in the character of war. The democratization of technology and collapse of time and space require dramatic, thoughtful changes in how we defend, deter, and fight. As with any huge bureaucracy, and the DoD is one of the world's largest, breaking the status quo requires leadership and endurance. Technology is critical to maintaining our war-fighting primacy, but we must be leery of the siren song that technology alone can protect us. More important is how new technologies are developed, tested, procured, and used. And that relies on the true competitive advantages of our people: ingenuity, common sense, and thoughtfulness grounded in a free society. Because war will continue to be the most stressful and consequential human endeavor, the most powerful weapon systems will remain the 6 inches between the ears of our citizens and the strength of their hearts and content of their souls. Military service is the most difficult task we ask of our citizens, and our nation is enormously blessed that so many young, patriotic Americans eagerly volunteer to carry such a heavy burden. We owe them everything, and we must do better. To do better, however, means recognizing and implementing 4 overriding priorities. Priority number 1, reestablish a culture of command accountability, non-politicization, and war-fighting focus. Priority 2, transform our armed forces for maximum effectiveness in an era of great power competition. Priority 3, provide necessary support to Department of Homeland Security, DHS, Border Protection operations. Border protection is a national security issue that requires sustained attention and effort by all elements of the executive branch. And priority 4, demand financial transparency and accountability. This chapter offers recommendations for improving our armed forces and the civilian organizations that support and oversee them. DoD policy, by far the most significant danger to America's security, freedoms, and prosperity, is China. China is by any measure the most powerful state in the world other than the United States itself. It apparently aspires to dominate Asia and then from that position become globally preeminent. If Beijing could achieve this goal, it could dramatically undermine America's core interest, including by restricting U.S. access to the world's most important market. Preventing this from happening must be the top priority for American foreign and defense policy. Beijing presents a challenge to American interest across the domains of national power, but the military threat that it imposes is especially acute and significant. China is undertaking a historic military buildup that includes increasing capability for power projection, not only in its own region, but also far beyond, as well as a dramatic expansion of its nuclear forces that could result in a nuclear force that matches or exceeds America's own nuclear arsenal. The most severe immediate threat that Beijing's military poses, however, is to Taiwan and other U.S. allies along the first island chain in the Western Pacific. If China could subordinate Taiwan or allies like the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, it could break apart any balancing coalition that is designed to prevent Beijing's hegemony over Asia. Accordingly, the United States must ensure that China does not succeed. This requires denial offense, the ability to make the subordination of Taiwan or other U.S. allies in Asia prohibitively difficult. Critically, the United States must be able to do this at a level of cost and risk that Americans are willing to bear, given the relative importance of Taiwan to China and to the U.S. The United States and its allies also face real threats from Russia, as evidenced by Vladimir Putin's brutal war in Ukraine, as well as from Iran, North Korea, and transnational terrorism at a time when decades of ill-advised military operations in the greater Middle East, the atrophy of our defense industrial base, the impact of sequestration, and effective disarmament by many U.S. allies have exacted a high toll on America's military. This is a grim landscape. The United States needs to deal with these threats forthrightly and with strength, but it also needs to be realistic. It cannot wish away these problems. Rather, it must confront them with a clear-eyed recognition of the need for choice, discipline, and adequate resources for defense. In this light, the U.S. defense strategy must identify China unequivocally as the top priority for the U.S. defense planning while modernizing and expanding the U.S. nuclear arsenal and sustaining an efficient and effective counterterrorism enterprise. U.S. allies must also step up, with some joining the United States in taking on China in Asia, while others take more of a lead in dealing with threats from Russia in Europe, Iran, and the Middle East, and North Korea. The reality is that achieving these goals will require more than spending on defense, both by the United States and by its allies, as well as an active support for reindustrialization and more support for allies' productive capacity so that we can scale our free world efforts together. Needed reforms: prioritize a denial defense against China. U.S. defense planning should focus on China and, in particular, the effective denial defense of Taiwan. This focus and priority for U.S. defense activities will deny China the first island chain. Number one, require that all defense efforts, from force planning to employment and posture, focus on ensuring the ability of American forces to prevail in the pacing scenario and deny China fait accompli against Taiwan. Number two, prioritize the U.S. conventional force planning construct to defeat a Chinese invasion of Taiwan before allocating resources to other missions, such as simultaneously fighting another conflict. The second bullet under reforms: increase allied conventional defense burden sharing. U.S. allies must take a far greater responsibility for their conventional defense. U.S. allies must play their part not only in dealing with China, but also in dealing with threats from Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Number one, make burden sharing a central part of U.S. defense strategy with the United States, not just helping allies to step up, but strongly encouraging them to do so. Number two, greater support spending and collaboration by Taiwan and allies in the Asia Pacific, like Japan and Australia, to create a collective defense model. Number three, transform NATO so that U.S. allies are capable of fielding the great majority of the conventional forces required to deter Russia, while relying on the United States primarily for our nuclear deterrent and select other capabilities, while reducing the U.S. force posture in Europe. Number four, sustain support for Israel, even as America empowers Gulf partners to take responsibility for their own coastal, air, and missile defenses, both individually and working collectively. Number five, enable South Korea to take the lead in its conventional defense against North Korea. Bullet three, under needed reforms: implement nuclear modernization and expansion. The United States manifestly needs to modernize, adapt, and expand its nuclear arsenal. Russia maintains and is actively brandishing a very large nuclear arsenal, but China is also undertaking a historic nuclear breakout. Number one, expand and modernize the U.S. nuclear force so that it has the size, sophistication, and tailoring to deter Russia and China simultaneously. And number two, develop a nuclear arsenal with the size, sophistication, and tailoring, including new capabilities at the theater level, to ensure that there is no circumstance in which America is exposed to serious nuclear coercion. Number four, under needed reforms, increase allied counterterrorist burden sharing. Transnational terrorism remains a threat to Americans even as we pivot toward Asia. Number one, sustain the military forces needed to deter, prevent, and combat terrorism, but at a sustainable cost in concert with other elements of national power and partner efforts. Number two, prioritize enhancing the capability of allies and partners to take the lead in combating terrorism in their regions. So we are going to stop there for today, and we'll dig into the rest of this chapter during our next session. Thank you for joining me today. And as always, my people are destroyed because of a lack of knowledge. So today and every day, get some knowledge.